Thank you for joining us today. I'm Charles Brewer, president of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the next 4 presentations will be at the clubhouse in the first floor grand ballroom, unless otherwise posted on our website. Founding member and chairman emeritus Pete Rainey will present next month with the subject, Old Soldiers Do Not Lie, They Become Politicians. Check our website for all our planned future programs. The September 24th annual dinner date is subject to change. As to my embarrassment, I discovered that a clubhouse concert on the Point was scheduled the same night. I'm trying to work out another date that will meet our speaker's schedule. We invite you, of course, to visit our website on a regular basis. That's civilwarstudygroup.org, as we make every attempt to keep it up to date. In addition, it has recently been redesigned, making access on tablets and smartphones more readable. As a reminder, our request that you mute your microphone and turn off your video is to ensure the best connection for everyone during the presentation. Also, the presentation is being recorded, and a link to the video on our YouTube channel will be sent out sometime this weekend. Our speaker today is Jeffrey Hunt, author of the very well-received series comparing the battle leaderships of Lee and Meade through several engagements after Gettysburg. His first in this series was Meade and Lee after Gettysburg, which covers engagements from Falling Waters to Culpeper Courthouse. The second was Meade and Lee at Bristow Station. Many of you will remember that Jeff was our speaker on this topic in July of 2019. Today, he will speak to us about the subject of his third book in the series, Meade and Lee at Rappahannock Station, the Army of the Potomac's first post-Gettysburg offensive from Kelly's Ford to the Rapidan, October 21 through November 20, 1863. Given the ending date of those engagements, one can only expect that his next book in the series will be about Mine Run. When our programs are at the clubhouse, our speakers will occasionally bring some of their books for sale. Over Zoom, obviously, that's not possible. None of Jeff's books appear to be in the stacks of the Orange County Public Library, regrettably, and that's something we'll try to correct. His first book, The Last Battle of the Civil War, Palmetto Ranch, is available at the Central Rappahannock Library. Of course, his books can be located and purchased online at the usual places such as Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. Our speaker, Jeffrey William Hunt, is the director of the Texas Military Forces Museum at Camp Mabry in Austin, Texas, and an adjunct professor of history at Austin Community College, where he has taught for 30 years. And he is no stranger to Fredericksburg, Texas, that is. From 1994 to 2007, he was curator of collections and director of Living History Program at the Admiral Nimitz National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. That happens to be Nimitz's hometown. He holds a bachelor's degree in government and a master's degree in history from the University of Texas at Austin. In 2013, Mr. Hunt was appointed an honorary admiral in the Texas Navy by Governor Rick Perry. So all of my fellow Navy veterans, we salute you, sir. Jeff, thank you for sharing your research with us today. Now you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me get the screen up and we'll get ourselves going here. There we go. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but this is the next best thing. As said, we'll be talking about the subject of my third book, which is the first real offensive undertaken by the Army of the Potomac after the Battle of Gettysburg, and that is the one that leads to the battle at Rappahannock Station. And just sort of to set the stage, we'll remember that after Lee retreated across the Potomac on July 13th of 1863, the Gettysburg campaign didn't come to an end. Meade crossed the river into the Loudoun Valley a few days later, and for the next 10 days, the two armies played a cat and mouse game along the Blue Ridge Mountains, with the Federals trying to trap the Confederates in the lower Shenandoah Valley and Lee trying to get through the mountain passes to return to central Virginia, where he could take up a blocking position defending Richmond in Culpeper County. And that was, of course, something he was successful at doing. Meade followed, and the beginning of August saw the two armies on either side of the upper Rappahannock River. And that is where Lincoln had Meade halt and detached 9,200 troops from the Army of the Potomac and sent them north to enforce the draft. For the next month, the two armies basically remained in place, recovering from Gettysburg. Lee pulled his infantry back behind the Rapidan, but left his cavalry inside Culpeper County throughout all of August. And by the beginning of September, both armies were back to their Gettysburg level strength. What followed was a great deal of maneuver on the strategic level and the operational level. The Confederates, of course, send Longstreet west to help out Bragg. That leads to the Confederate victory at Chickamauga, which then prompts the Federals to send the 11th and 12th Corps west to help redeem that situation. Meade had advanced into Culpeper County in mid-September to confirm that Longstreet had gone, and this had prompted the cavalry battle at Culpeper Courthouse. But once Meade moves on to the Rapidan, he's trying to figure out what to do, how to get at Lee when Chickamauga happens, and he has to send two corps west, and that leads Meade to conclude that he no longer has sufficient numbers to justify an offensive, even though the return of those 9,200 troops who had gone north to enforce the draft offset the loss of the 13,000 men in the two corps that had gone west. Lee took advantage of the situation and launched what comes to be known as the Bristoe Station campaign, which I had the pleasure of talking to all of you about 2 years ago. And this drives the Federals back to Centerville, almost into the defenses of Washington. And Lee's hope of catching the Union Army in the move and destroying some portion of it did not materialize. Meade withdrew too quickly and too deftly. The sting of the retreat somewhat mitigated by the Federal rearguard action at Bristoe Station, where Gouverneur Warren's Second Corps shot up two of A.P. Hill's brigades in a brief engagement on October 14th. And following that fight, Lee recognized that there was no point in pursuing Meade any further. He could have outflanked him again by moving into the Loudoun Valley, but he understood that all Meade would do in response was withdrawal into the fortifications of Washington, D.C., where the Confederates would not be able to get at him. Lee would have liked to have hovered along the Potomac River, and keep the Federals north of the Virginia border through the winter, but the Confederate supply situation made that impossible. The Northern Virginia was a wasteland after 2 years of war. You couldn't live off the country, and the Confederate supply system was so anemic that there was no possibility of Richmond managing to feed and supply the Confederate Army if it stayed near the Potomac. And so what Lee decided to do was to pull back into Culpeper County and to take up a position, at least temporarily, behind the upper Rappahannock River. And as the Confederates withdrew, they utterly destroyed the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And this picture shows some of their handiwork. The rebels basically obliterated about 26 miles of track between Bristoe Station and Rappahannock Station, which is right on the upper Rappahannock River. They pulled up the rails, piled up the cross ties, set them afire, laid the rails on top of the cross ties, bent them into unusable shapes. They tore up every bridge, every culvert. They chopped down the telegraph poles, and even the Federal troops who followed in their wake were impressed with how completely the Confederates had erased the railroad. And Lee did this to slow Meade's pursuit because he knew that the Orange and Alexandria was the sole line of supply upon which the Army of the Potomac relied, and that Meade could not move very far forward and away from his railhead and feed his army. And so when the Federals inevitably pursued the Confederates, back toward the upper Rappahannock, they would have to move basically at the pace of railroad repair. And there was a slight possibility that that would take so long that Meade would decide that it would be best to go into winter quarters rather than pursue a fall campaign. Lee understood that that was unlikely, and of course it turns out that that will not be the case. The Federals got that railroad repaired to within 9 miles of the Rappahannock within about a month, and so by the time that you get to the end of October, this is where the armies are. And so you can see that the Army of the Potomac is basically on a line from Warrenton down to Warrenton Junction. The rail repairs are just a little shy of that. And Lee's army is still along the upper Rappahannock in Culpeper County. And Meade is picking up reports that the fords in Culpeper County are fortified, and that the rebels have built a fortified bridgehead on the north bank of the river at Rappahannock Station. And for which purpose, offensive or defensive, he cannot say at this point. But this is the situation that Meade is looking at when he's finally got the railroad close enough to the river that he can consider undertaking an offensive campaign. And it's obvious to everyone that Meade is expected to undertake an offensive campaign by the Lincoln administration. That's not only necessary from military terms in Virginia and politically, but also you want to keep Lee busy so that he cannot detach further reinforcements to Tennessee, where the Confederates have laid Chattanooga and the Army of the Cumberland under siege. So Meade's looking at his situation, and he realizes that he has 3 basic options to tackle Lee. And the first of these is to swing his army wide to the west, cross the upper Rappahannock at a place like, say, Waterloo, and move into Madison County for either the purpose of then trying to swing in to Culpeper from the west and attack Lee around Culpeper Courthouse, or bypassing Lee and driving below the Rapidan to go after Gordonsville, which is where the Virginia Central meets the Orange and Alexandria, and the Virginia Central, as I'm sure you all know, connects the Shenandoah Valley to the Richmond and Fredericksburg Potomac Railroad, which then goes down to Richmond. So that was a viable strategic target, but it was 60 miles away from Warrenton. And if Meade tried this strategy, you would have to let go of the Orange and Alexandria and rely on living off the country, which was dubious, or slow-moving and vulnerable supply trains of wagons. And so this really wasn't a practicable solution. If he moved out to the west, he would also take the Army of the Potomac out from between Lee and Washington, which is something that Northern generals had learned a long time ago that the administration was unlikely to permit. The second option would be to assail Lee's defenses along the upper Rappahannock, and this is something that Lee really hoped the Federals would do, and therefore it's something that Meade was not very anxious to attempt. This bridgehead at Rappahannock Station in particular was worrisome. It would require the Federals to spend an enormous force to either flatten it or to screen it, because if they didn't do one of those 2 things, the Confederates could launch an offensive out of that bridgehead that would threaten to cut the Army of the Potomac off from Washington. And if Meade wants to get across the river, he's going to have to find an easier place to do it. Kelly's Ford, where the high ground on the north bank of the Rappahannock is dominant over the territory to the south, or in this case, the west. The Federals could get across the river very easily here, but if they had to leave a substantial force to screen or attack Rappahannock Station, only half the Federal Army could cross at Kelly's Ford, and that would make them vulnerable to a Confederate counterattack by the bulk of Lee's army. And so Meade looks at the possibilities of fighting his way over the upper Rappahannock, confronting the Confederate fortifications. He says, no, that's not a good idea either. And this is reinforced by the fact that Meade has, since August, tried to talk Lincoln and Halleck out of using the Orange and Alexandria Railroad as the Army's line of communication. That single track line goes all the way to Alexandria on the Potomac, so it runs from Culpeper Courthouse northeast, is some 50 miles in length between those 2 points, and all of that distance runs through Confederate territory. And rebel guerrillas, John Mosby, for example, are very active there. That long line is vulnerable to Jeb Stuart's cavalry raids, and so Meade has to defend the entire length of it. Right now he has an entire infantry division, some 5,000 troops guarding that railroad line. And to me, this makes no sense. This is militarily illogical. He was aware that at the beginning of September, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac were almost equal in strength, about 72,000 Confederates to 88,000 Federals. And although after Longstreet has left for the Western Theater, Lee's been reduced to 55,000 men. Meade still continues to believe that the rebels have approximately the same strength as the Army of the Potomac, and this is one of the reasons that he had withdrawn instead of standing to fight during the Bristow campaign. Meade is also troubled by recent history. He understands that the Army of the Potomac, battle after battle after battle, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in fact, where he stands in the end of August of 1863, the Army of the Potomac has never been smaller since its creation in the aftermath of the Battle of Bull Run. Now, whereas the Army is smaller, the casualties in each succeeding battle are getting larger. And Gettysburg, of course, has been the bloodiest of them so far. If you were to fight 4 more Gettysburg battles with 4 more Gettysburg scale casualties, the Army of the Potomac would in fact cease to exist. Now, so would the Army of Northern Virginia, but nonetheless, this is problematic for me, who believes that in the next fights, the Confederates will defend fortifications, and it will take a 3-to-1 advantage in infantry to overwhelm those fortifications. And right now, he thinks he's got a 1-to-1 or at best 1.5-to-1 numerical advantage, which is not enough. He has seen the 2-year enlistments expire, and most of those troops go home. He knows that the 3-year enlistments are going to expire in March and April and May, and if all those troops go home, as they probably will, then the Army's manpower problem will get even worse. Volunteering has basically dried up, and the draft has produced riots. Meade does not think that the draft is going to bring him enough men, and certainly not the right kind of men, to replace the veteran troops that he would lose in a big battle or through the expiration of enlistments. And so he sees no reason to fight battles that do not promise decisive results. Fighting big bloody battles to displace the enemy for 10 or 20 or even 50 miles are really kind of pointless. And they are especially pointless if you can get the same result through maneuver. And so Meade has long wanted to abandon the Orange and Alexandria as a line of advance. It's vulnerable. He has to defend it with a lot of infantry, which weakens his combat power, which makes the front line odds even worse. Better to let go of the O&A and find a shorter, safer line of supply. And so his third option, and this is the one he prefers, is to give Lee the slip and use the geographic reality that along the upper Rappahannock, the ground on the north bank is higher than the ground on the south bank. And this ought to allow the Army of the Potomac, if it moves quickly and it moves with some degree of secrecy, to shift from Warrenton toward Fredericksburg and to get across the river before the rebels know what's going on. And once you're in Fredericksburg, you can change the Army of the Potomac's base of supplies to Akia Landing, which is only 15 miles north of Fredericksburg on the Potomac. And a 15-mile railroad is much easier to defend than a 50-mile stretch of railroad. If this all sounds familiar to you, it should, because where we are right now at the end of October 1863 is pretty much exactly where the two armies were at the end of October 1862, only with Burnside in command of the AOP, having just taken over for George McClellan. And this rapid shift toward Fredericksburg is exactly the plan that Burnside had carried out. And he had taken Lee initially by surprise using the geographic barrier that is the northern bank of the upper Rappahannock River. And if the pontoon bridges that Burnside had needed had gotten to Fredericksburg on time, the outcome of that campaign might have been very different. In all likelihood, it would have forced Lee to pull back to the North Anna River, where he would find his next best line of defense for Richmond. And so Meade figures if he does the same thing, the Confederates have to abandon the Rappahannock, they have to abandon the Rapidan. The Army of the Potomac gets a shorter line of supply. It does all of that without suffering any casualties, and it puts itself in a much better position to launch the spring 1864 campaign. So as far as Meade is concerned, the military logic here is undeniable. And he knows that Lincoln and Halleck had vetoed this kind of proposal in August and September, but he also feels that now that the Confederates have shown how vulnerable a Union position in Culpeper County was, courtesy of their Bristow campaign, the administration is not going to give him any resistance here. So he starts to issue orders to have his army prepare to sidle to the southeast toward Fredericksburg. And so this is Meade's thinking. Now, on the other side of the upper Rappahannock, we have the Army of Northern Virginia, and it's sitting inside Culpeper County, which is a very beautiful part of Virginia, but militarily, it's a very problematic part of Virginia. If you're a Confederate Army on the offensive, Culpeper is a great place to be because the roads that lead northwest out of Culpeper take you to the passes in the Blue Ridge Mountains that lead to the Shenandoah Valley, which of course is a dagger pointed into Union territory. And the rebels had used it in 1862 and 1863 in the Sharpsburg and the Gettysburg campaigns. But from every other perspective, Culpeper is a problematic place to have an army. First off, we note that Culpeper is formed on its northern, its eastern, and its southern sides by the upper Rappahannock River, which flows roughly from northwest to southeast, and the Rapidan, which flows roughly west to east until it runs into, converges with the upper Rappahannock. And so on a map, these two rivers look like a V laid on its side with its mouth opening toward the series of ridges that march upward toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. The western flank of Culpeper is formed partially by the Robinson's River, which is rather small, not much of a military obstacle unless it's flooding. And on the north bank of the upper Rappahannock, as we've noted, the ground is higher typically than on the south bank. And the same thing, it kind of is true in reverse along the Rapidan, where the ground south of the Rapidan is higher than the ground north of it. So in a sense, you can think of Culpeper as sort of a bowl with the territory north of the upper Rappahannock and south of the Rapidan looking down into it. And this presents certain problems. If you're the Confederates, it means the Federals can maneuver basically out of your sight, and you're not really sure what they're doing. The rivers are only bridged at Rappahannock Station and Rapidan Station, where the Orange and Alexandria crosses them. But note that the Federals had burned the Rappahannock Station Bridge during their Bristow retreat, and the Confederates have not rebuilt it. They are gaining communication with their North Bank fortifications through a pontoon bridge that's been laid about 300 yards upstream from the burnt O&A bridge. Nonetheless, these are not wide rivers. They're not particularly deep. There are plenty of fords that can be used to cross these rivers to gain access into Culpeper County, whether you're advancing from the north or you're advancing from the south. But one of the problems with these fords, of course, is that they can disappear. These two rivers can flood very quickly, even after a relatively modest storm. And therefore, if you fight a battle inside this Culpeper V, whether you're on the offensive or the defensive, you've got a major river to your rear, which could flood, if the weather turns against you, and the fords, which would be your route of escape if that battle goes badly for you, might not exist anymore. And this compounds the fact that although Culpeper is very pretty, it's mostly open, rolling terrain with the occasional abrupt small mountain like Cedar or Pony or Stonehouse, which can rise as high as 900 or 1,000 feet. Beyond that, Culpeper doesn't really have much in the way of good defensive terrain. In other words, for an army standing on the defensive, there's no place to really anchor your flanks, no geographic obstacle that can secure it. And those flanks, especially as we get toward the apex of the V, begin to get very close to rivers. And if the enemy slips around them, he's between you and the river, and therefore he could potentially cut off your line of retreat. And so these military problems associated with making a stand in Culpeper is why Lee had pulled his infantry out of the Culpeper V in August of '63. It's why Meade had decided not to stand and fight in Culpeper County in October of 1863. And knowing all of this very well, Lee, at the conclusion of the Bristow Station campaign, has to decide if he's going to make his next stand along the upper Rappahannock and therefore occupy Culpeper County, or withdraw behind the Rapidan. And so, like Meade, Lee has a couple of options. The first option, the one that seems the most logical, would be to pull back behind the Rapidan where the high ground is in your favor and it makes these fords eminently defensible. And this also puts you closer to the Virginia Central Railroad, which is your major line of supply. And here you do not have a river at your back if you have to fight a battle. The one drawback to a line along the Rapidan is that there are so many fords that it's impossible to defend all of them. So if Lee centers his army on Orange Courthouse and spreads it out 25 miles, he can cover a lot of fords, but he can't cover the easternmost fords, Germanna Ford and Eli's Ford and the other fords that lead toward the apex of the rivers. And therefore, the Federals will always have a relatively easy way to get around the Confederate right flank. And if they do that, then they threaten to get between the Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond, which would be a calamity, or they could swing west to try and attack Lee's army before it could concentrate. And the only possible defense against either one of those moves for Lee is to rush his army as quickly as possible from west to east along the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road to try and strike the Federals before they can get between him and Richmond, or to meet them if they are turning in his direction. And this is a circumstance where any mischance could be a disaster. The roads are bad. You find out what the Yankees are doing a handful of hours too late, and this whole scheme of defense would collapse, and you would have to make a desperate rush into Spotsylvania County to try and stay between the Federal Army and Richmond. And not least of all, in Lee's estimation, one of the problems with this defensive stance is that it puts him in a reactive pose. The enemy has the initiative, and he can only wait for them to move. And this is not the sort of thing that Robert E. Lee likes. And so it would be better, potentially, to stay in Culpeper County. If you stay in Culpeper County, you are in a position to interdict any Federal move into Madison County to try and get to Gordonsville, or to hit the Yankees before they can slam into you. You're fighting on the wide end of the Culpeper V, not the narrow end. The other advantage to being in Culpeper County is that if you want to launch another invasion of the North in the spring, you're already positioned to do that. Whether Lee would make the attempt or not is uncertain, but being here makes that a viable possibility. But if you stay in Culpeper County, how do you negate all of the disadvantages of the poor terrain there, the high ground on the north bank of the Rappahannock? And Lee's answer has that fortification, that fortified bridgehead at Rappahannock Station, because with that fortification there, he's able to do a couple of things. First off, if the Federals do attempt to sail toward Fredericksburg, Lee could erupt out of those fortifications and get between the Union Army and Washington, D.C. And that would, of course, force Meade to turn around and fight him at a disadvantage. Lee believes that Meade is much too good a general to make that kind of a mistake. So what's more probable, he figures, is that Meade will try and push him away from the upper Rappahannock by sending part of his army to either contain or to crush the bridgehead at Rappahannock Station, while he crosses the other half of his army at Kelly's Ford and enters Culpeper County with the intention of trying to attack the Confederates at Rappahannock Station from the rear. If Meade pursues that plan, he will have to divide his army, and that's exactly what Lee's counting on. The half that crosses at Kelly's Ford will be contained by rebel forces close by that ford until Lee can concentrate the bulk of his army and throw it against the portion of Meade's that's crossed into Culpeper County and entered Lee's trap, while the other half of the Union Army is stalemated here at Rappahannock Station. And so this plan of defense basically allows Lee to become the aggressor, and it offers a chance to wreck part of the Union Army. And so this is a very bold scheme of defense. It's very typical of Lee. And of course, Meade recognizes what Lee's attempting to do here. And this is why he wants to avoid the trap and try and make a very rapid shift toward Fredericksburg before the Confederates know what's going on. And therefore he could reorient his base of supply. And if Lee comes on to the Orange and Alexandria, it won't matter. And at any rate, Lee would probably have to rush toward Fredericksburg to stay between the Union Army and Richmond. So Lee's decided to stay in Culpeper County, relying on that fortified bridgehead at Rappahannock Station as the linchpin of his defensive scheme. Meade has decided that he's going to avoid this potential trap by moving quickly toward Fredericksburg. That is, until he finds out on November 3rd that Lincoln and Halleck are not going to let him do this. He had sent them news of what his plan was and told them that he was beginning to put it into motion. He asked only that they let him know if that plan was not approved of as quickly as possible. And within 12 hours, Halleck told him, no, we're not going to let you do this. We told you we weren't going to let you do this last August. We reiterated that in September. Why in the world do you think we're going to let you do it in November? Neither Lincoln nor Halleck have any faith that the Army of the Potomac can get to Fredericksburg before the Army of Northern Virginia. They believe that the job of Meade's army is to go out and fight Lee, wherever Lee is, with the goal of destroying Lee. That surely will be no easier at Fredericksburg than it will be around Culpeper Courthouse. Moving to Fredericksburg is just shifting your problems from one point to another. And so Meade's plan is disapproved. He writes a very unhappy letter to his wife and confidant, Margaret, saying, they want me to fight. They're always telling me to go out and fight, but they won't sanction my plans. They won't let me have any real freedom of maneuver. They seem more interested in keeping their fingerprints off any defeat than in supporting me. They're setting me up to be the scapegoat. So if things go wrong, I take all the blame, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to play their game there. So there's real tension between Washington and Meade, and this has led Meade on several occasions to either offer to resign his command or to tell the administration, if you're not happy with me, go ahead and relieve me. I've got no special claim to command of the Army of the Potomac. If I'm not doing what you want, you ought to relieve me, and I should be relieved. But how do you relieve the victor of Gettysburg, especially if he's not suffered defeat? And the one thing that you can say for Meade is he's not fallen into any of Lee's traps yet. In the Bristow campaign, Lee played the same game on the Army of the Potomac that he'd played on John Pope's Army of Virginia, which led to the disastrous Union defeat at Second Manassas. Meade had avoided falling into that same kind of snare. And so there's no way that you get rid of Meade. And as Lincoln says when he's urged to do it, who would I replace him with? Who in the Army of the Potomac is better than George Meade? especially after Gettysburg. And so Meade is going to stay the commander of the Army. But the plan he wants to execute has been turned down, and that means he's going to have to find another one. And to George Meade's great credit, he dutifully goes about doing that. He's going to go into the next operation and give it his all. He's not going to be half-hearted. He's not going to basically go in such a way that he's bound to fail just so he can turn to Washington and say, see, I told you so. He's going to make a good plan, and under the circumstances, he's going to take a considerable risk. And so what is the plan that he is going to follow? Well, he's going to have to follow the plan that Robert E. Lee wants him to follow. He's going to have to divide his army. He's going to have to deal with Rappahannock Station and Kelly's Ford at the same time, because this is the only real chance that he has. He needs to get the army over the Rappahannock at both places pretty much at the same time, so that he can unite it in Culpeper County before Lee can throw the bulk of his army against a portion of the federal army. And so the only method of really winning here is to smash the Rappahannock Station fortifications at roughly the same time that you cross the other half of the army at Kelly's Ford. And this means that Lee has predicted Meade's plan perfectly. Meade has to divide his army, and he does that by putting Major General John Sedgwick in charge of the 26,000 men in the 5th and 6th Corps. Major General William French gets command of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Corps, which has about 29,000 men. Sedgwick and French, of course, are the two ranking major generals in the Army of the Potomac, and that's why they get those jobs. And having divided his army, this is how Meade is going to maneuver it. So the 6th and the 5th Corps under Sedgwick will concentrate on Rappahannock Station. The 2nd and the 3rd Corps, with the 3rd Corps in the lead, will move against Kelly's Ford. The 1st Corps will go down to Morrisville and act as a reserve. The Federal Cavalry, Buford on the right flank, Kilpatrick on the left, and Gregg's Cavalry Division defending the Army's reserve artillery and wagon trains, which will concentrate near Morrisville. And one division of the 1st Corps, of course, is still going to be spread out guarding the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And the Federals know that they're going to get across at Kelly's Ford relatively easily, but it's going to be all important for French to act aggressively, get as many troops over the river as quickly as he can, and for Sedgwick to destroy the Confederate bridgehead promptly and get his half of the army across the river to link up with French. If Sedgwick cannot do that, and Meade is not certain that he can, the Federals don't know a lot about those Rappahannock Station fortifications, but they believe that they're very strong. They might be impenetrable to assault. And so if Sedgwick can't destroy that bridgehead, then he has to screen it. And on the night of the day's offensive action, which is going to begin on November 7th, he's going to send the 5th Corps and part of the 6th Corps marching rapidly 6 miles downstream to reinforce French at Kelly's Ford before Lee throws the bulk of the Army of Northern Virginia against that wing of the Army of the Potomac. So that's Meade's plan. He has carefully organized it. He has carefully staffed it. He is going to manage to spring a surprise on Lee. Although he's going to do what Lee expects him to do, Lee doesn't know when he's going to do it, and Meade's going to move very swiftly, and that's to his credit. But he's not terribly confident. And he writes his wife, Margaret, on the evening of November 6th that he's very frustrated that the plan that he thinks he should be following has been disapproved. Now he's being forced to play Lee's game. He's going to have to attack across the river, and fighting your way across a river is one of the hardest things an army can do, and his own experience means that he's not, as he puts it, over-sanguine of success, but this is the only thing that I have left to try. And if it doesn't work, he doesn't really know what the Army of the Potomac could do. And this distresses him mightily. He's been suffering from a great deal of anxiety ever since the launch of the Bristow Station campaign. And once again, he wishes himself out of his job. He tells Margaret that he thought he knew what being commander of the Army of the Potomac was going to be like when he took the job, but it's been far worse, far more difficult than he expected, and so much so that he regrets that he had ever agreed to take the post. But he had taken it because he had been ordered to do it, not offered the job. And since he's got the job, he is a dutiful soldier, and he is going to obey orders, and he's going to do the best that he can, even though he believes that his best will never be enough for the Lincoln administration. So this is Meade's state of mind when he launches his army into action on the morning of November 7th, 1863. And this is going to be a surprise to his own troops, who thought that they were about to go into winter quarters. And of course, it's going to be a surprise to the Confederate Army, which thought it was about to go into winter quarters as well. So the day's first action, is going to take place at Kellysville, which is on the banks of the Upper Rappahannock. This is the town that is nearby the critical ford. And for the Confederates, this was almost an indefensible position. As we can see here, that there's dominant high ground on the north bank of the river. The Federals get that high ground and put artillery up there. They dominate everything on the south bank. And these are very low hills here. There's the town. Here's the ford. The Confederates do have some fortifications here, but those fortifications are really only sufficient to fend off minor probes or cavalry attacks against a serious assault. They're not going to stop anybody. And Lee understands this, and his Second Corps commander, Richard Ewell, understands this. And Ewell's in charge of this part of the Confederate defense. And so what the Confederates plan here is really just a delaying action. And they dispose their forces accordingly. So right here at the ford, you have 7 companies of the 2nd North Carolina Infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Stallings. Now, Colonel Cox was usually in command of that regiment, but he stepped up to brigade command because the usual boss, Stephen Dotson Ramseur, is on leave to get married. And Ramseur's brigade, of course, is part of Robert Rhodes' division. Most of Rhodes' division is about a mile from the river, but close by in support of Stallings' 225 men at the ford is the 30th North Carolina, 500 men strong under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Sellers, and the Fluvanna Artillery under the command of Captain John Massey, which has got 6 12-pounder Napoleons. But the only thing these guys are supposed to do is to delay a Federal crossing for a few hours, give Rhodes time to form his division, time for Ewell to order Edward Johnson's division to reinforce Rhodes, and then they would contain the Federal crossing here to within a mile or 2 of the river and hold it in place so that that night Lee could bring up the rest of the Army of the Potomac and the next morning hurl it in a massive counterattack against however many Yankees managed to get across here. So if the Federals want to cross at Kelly's Ford, the Confederates cannot stop them. They don't intend to try to stop them. And of course, this works into Lee's plan. He wants them to cross at Kelly's Ford. He wants them to walk into the trap because if he can hold the other half of the Union Army in place at Rappahannock Station, it creates the situation where almost all of the Army of Northern Virginia can attack half of the Army of the Potomac. And so the Battle of Kelly's Ford basically proceeds in the way everybody knew that it would. Here is the Federal artillery up on that high ground. There's Kellysville down there, the ford. You can see the wood line where the 30th North Carolina and the Fluvanna artillery were camped. A little earthwork here where the Confederate artillery came out and tried to assist the defense of the ford. But given the dominance of this position, it's clear that the Confederates are not going to be able to stop the Federals, and they don't. And this is the way the battle plays itself out. The Federals get their artillery up there. They drive the Confederates into their fortifications and some of them into the buildings of Kellysville. The Fluvanna artillery comes out, tries to duel with the Yankee artillery, but it's outgunned 3 batteries to 1. And after basically firing 10 shots, a tube, it's forced to withdraw. Sillars very gallantly but foolishly attempts to move his 500-man strong 30th North Carolina to Kellysville to reinforce Stallings. And this is a bad move because, of course, that entire 700-yard distance is dominated by Yankee artillery. The ground is broken. There are several fences. And by the time the 30th North Carolina gets into Kellysville, it's completely broken up and demoralized. And a lot of its men take shelter in cellars, and they can't be budged from there. Stallings tells Sellers to get your men out of here. You're contributing nothing to the defense except casualties. And the 30th North Carolina therefore retreats back across this ground. But of course, not everyone is eager to do that. About 180 of its men refuse to leave the village. And so with any hope of Confederate reinforcements now beaten back, the Federals are free to launch an assault across the ford, and that job is given to the 1st United States Sharpshooters under Colonel Caspar Tripp. And rather than launch a direct frontal attack into the teeth of the rebel defenses, he sends 4 companies downstream to flank them at a less well-defended spot. And once they're across the river, they're going to hit the flank of the Confederate fortifications. And at that point, the rest of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters will charge across the ford. And the Federals pull this off. And it works perfectly. Alfred Wood is on hand to witness the battle. He's the one who drew that picture of the Yankee guns firing down onto the rebels. He drew this picture of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters assailing the ford. And the Federals, in some tough hand-to-hand fighting, managed to take the Confederate fortifications, at which point Stallings withdraws his surviving troops from Kellysville. So the fighting, the actual assault on the ford, really only took about 40 minutes. The entire action, a couple of hours. For the Federals, incredibly light casualties, 7 dead, 35 wounded. The Confederates suffered a lot more, 45 dead, 78 wounded, which speaks to the dominance of the Union artillery. And then 295 missing, most of those from the 30th North Carolina. About 130, 140 of its men refused to retreat, even when Stallings pulled out and stayed behind and were captured. So the Federals have crossed at Kelly's Ford. And French immediately orders up pontoon trains to put down bridges. By nightfall, he's going to have 2 of 3 Third Corps divisions over the river and a 3rd crossing. The 2nd Corps is going to come up and be ready to cross first thing in the morning. So success, but Federal probes find Confederates under Rhodes' division blocking the path toward the Orange and Alexandria and Rappahannock Station. Johnson's division blocking the path toward Brandy Station. And so it's clear that although this opening Federal gambit has been successful, really all Meade has done is begin to walk into Lee's trap. And things could go very badly unless the Federals manage to crush the Confederate fortifications at Rappahannock Station. This is a drawing of the railroad bridge at Rappahannock Station in August of 1863. It was 500 feet long, but remember, this has been burned. And so the Confederates are defending this high ground on the north bank of the river. And on the west side of the Orange and Alexandria, there is a ridge on which they built fortifications. And on the east side, the ground is flat, but they built some fortifications here as well. This is what the area looked like, at least part of it. These pictures are taken in August of 1862. So this is Rappahannock Station's, the actual station, the railroad stop. There's the line of the railroad. These buildings are all burned by the period that we're talking about. And this tree line right there is the river. This is a photo looking north from the south bank of the river. There's your railroad bridge. And this tree line here is a high ridge that is on the north end of a very broad plain of flat ground east of the river. So kind of try and keep those things in mind because it's going to help explain something a little bit later. So French and his wing are already across at Kelly's Ford. Now we're going to deal with Sedgwick's wing, the 6th and the 5th Corps coming down to Rappahannock Station. And they arrive about noon. And when the head of those two columns reach the Rappahannock Station area, the only thing that they are facing are 900 Confederate infantrymen and a 4-gun battery of artillery, the Louisiana Guard artillery. The infantry are the famous Louisiana Tigers under Brigadier General Harry Hayes, who's an extremely competent officer, very aggressive, but he's on court-martial duty today. So Colonel Davison Penn of the 7th Louisiana is in command of the brigade, and they've only got 900 soldiers. And coming against them now are 26,000 Federals. And these Federal troops are under the command of Major General George Sykes, who's got the 5th Corps, and Major General Horatio Wright, who is now commanding the 6th Corps because Sedgwick has moved up to wing command. And so Wright, who usually led the 1st Division, that corps is now in temporary charge of the 6th Corps. The Federals, remember, don't know much about the Confederate fortifications at Rappahannock Station, but they suspect that they are very strongly defended and that they are very stout works. And so Sedgwick is going to be careful. And Meade is basically put it in his mind to be careful. He's warned him, look, Lee might counterattack out of this bridgehead, so you need to be prepared for that. I'm not sure that you can smash these fortifications, so be prepared to shift the large bulk of your troops to Kelly's Ford overnight. And so Sedgwick, very understandably, comes in. He goes, I'm going to be prepared to use my entire force to deal with this situation. And when he arrives and his troops begin to go into line of battle, the 5th Corps to the east of the railroad, the 6th Corps to the west of the railroad, their skirmishers, of course, out in front. The Confederate dispositions are such that 3 of Hayes / Penn's regiments, the 7th Louisiana, the 8th Louisiana, and the 6th Louisiana, are deployed a quarter of a mile to half a mile in front of their fortifications for observation purposes. So they're on these ridges out here, and only the 9th Louisiana Guard artillery are actually in the bridgehead's fortifications. The 5th Louisiana is manning earthworks south of the river and east of the railroad. And these Louisiana troops don't have any cavalry other than a few vedettes out in front of them. They see the Federals coming. They spread the alarm. They send word. Penn sends word back to Jubal Early, whose division the Tigers are from, and word goes to Ewell and word goes to Lee. So the alarm is spread, but it's going to take some time, an hour or two, for the messengers to get to those various headquarters. And in the interim, these Louisiana troops see 26,000 Federal troops, 2 corps, go into line of battle opposite them. And you can imagine how daunting that sight must have been. They're well aware of the fact that there are only 900 of them, that they're on the wrong side of the river, that there's a single pontoon bridge by which they could get across the river, that there are no Confederate infantry and not much artillery that's very close to reinforce them. And if the Federals move aggressively and quickly, Penn will have no choice but to abandon the bridgehead. Fortunately for the rebels, Sedgwick does not move quickly or aggressively. He takes 2 hours, almost 3 hours, in fact, to deploy those 26,000 men. And this is going to give the off-balance, surprised Confederates a real period of grace to regain their equilibrium. Penn pulls his 3 regiments back into the fortifications. He brings the 5th Louisiana to the north side of the river and leaves behind just a skirmish line to keep an eye on the Yankees here. Lee and Early both ride toward the bridgehead. Ewell will take care of things facing French, but Lee understands that it's here at Rappahannock Station that the true fate of his battle plan is going to play out. Early orders the rest of his division toward the river. Lee tells A.P. Hill to get his corps ready for action, and the 2 artillery batteries that are close by under Graham and Dance are ordered north to occupy previously dug earthworks on the south bank of the river, from which they can cover the pontoon bridge, and they can also fire over their own works to hit the ridges on which the Confederate west of the railroad had been based, and to at least put indirect fire on the ground between that ridge and the bridgehead itself. So these are the initial dispositions, but they represent something very important, because if Sedgwick had moved aggressively, if he had gone forward with even a single division on either side of the railroad, he would have forced the Confederates to abandon the bridgehead and would have had the whole second half of November 7th to try and get across the river as Meade's orders dictated that he do. Because Sedgwick took time to deploy his entire wing, before he's going to move forward at all, he throws away a great opportunity to take the bridgehead without a fight, and to do it very, very quickly. And this gives the Confederates time to try and bring up troops to resist whatever advance the Federals might pursue after this entire mass of troops is deployed. That's not to say that what Sedgwick is doing here is not going to prove beneficial to him, because psychologically it is incredibly important, because the Confederates who are defending the Rappahannock Station bridgehead now know the full extent of the odds deployed against them, and they're very nervous. Their position is a shallow one. It backs up to the river. And in this particular spot, the river is very wide and it's very deep. And of course, it's November, so the water is very cold. Before the war, the Rappahannock Canal Company built a dam above the railroad bridge to make a pond for docking canal boats. And that dam is still there. And so this part of the river is much wider and much deeper than most of the upper Rappahannock. And therefore it is unfordable any place except where the stone pylons of the destroyed railroad bridge are, which means that if you're east of the railroad, you might be able to forge your way to escape. But if you're west of the railroad, that pontoon bridge is your sole means of getting out of this trap. And if the Federals start to move, if they bring even a fraction of the enormous force that they're deploying, these Confederate troops from Louisiana, who are veterans, know they're not going to stop them. And of course, these are not men inclined to throw their lives away unnecessarily. They recognize an untenable tactical situation when they see it. So that psychological impact of Sedgwick's deployment is going to turn out to be very important. Not until 3 o'clock is Sedgwick ready to move. And when he does move, he moves with just a small part of his command. So he's going to send his skirmishers forward on both sides of the railroad. And on each side of the railroad, he's going to advance a single division to support those skirmishers. On the east side of the railroad, that will be Joseph Bartlett's division of the 5th Corps, which will go forward in a column of divisions. And this is going to be a standard Federal formation during the day. Each regiment is divided into a division, which means 2 companies. And so you have 5 lines, 2 companies wide in a regimental formation. And then in a brigade, you've got 2 companies, or rather 2 regiments abreast. And so these formations are something akin to human battering rams. They're going to support the skirmishers going forward east of the railroad. Brigadier General Albion Howe's division is going to go forward to support the skirmishers west of the railroad. Now, once the skirmishers manage to form a screening line around the bridgehead, they're going to stop about 200 yards in front of the Confederate works. At that point, Bartlett's division is going to take cover, but Howe's division is supposed to take the high ground that the 7th and the 8th Louisiana had initially been holding, so that the Federals can put artillery there and try and shell the rebels out of their position. So when the Federals begin to move, this is what it looks like. You see the Confederate skirmishers make a fighting withdrawal back into their fortifications. The Federal skirmishers come down, and they're going to form a line, a semicircular line around the earthworks, but they're also going to take Beverly Ford to the west and Norman's Ford to the east. And once those skirmishers are in place, Bartlett's going to swing most of his troops onto this high ground, paralleling the railroad, and Howe, of course, is going to take this ridge where Sedgwick wants to put Union artillery. So between 3 and 3:30, this is what's going on. The Confederates are forced back. The Confederate skirmishers, rather, are forced back into their fortifications, and the Federals manage to get themselves into position to try and bombard the rebels into retreat. Now, for the Federals, what are they looking at? There had been a fight at Rappahannock Station in August of 1862, the Confederates south of the river, the Federals north of it. And at that time, Edwin Forbes had drawn the scene. And so this actually tells us a lot about what's going on in November of 1863. So over here, these buildings, this would have been Rappahannock Station. Those are all burned. They're gone. But you see the smokestack of a locomotive there. That's the line of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. The number 4 is the river right there. And then this ridge is where the Confederate fortifications are in 1863. And the 2 batteries that the Confederates have brought up to reinforce are on these little hills on the other side of the river. And down here we see this snake rail fence. That is the Freeman's Ford Road, which runs west of Freeman's Ford, east of Kelly's Ford. It's about 200 yards in front of the top of this ridge where the Confederate fortifications are. And that road is partially sunken. So this is where the Federal skirmishers are going to go to ground. And note that this is a very gentle slope. This is militarily not very daunting at all. And there's no obstacle here. The Confederates have built no defensive ditches, although there is one naturally occurring drainage ditch that sort of slants down across the face of this ridge. There is no abatis, and for good reason, because if you put a bunch of defensive ditches here and you build an abatis, then you make it a lot harder for the Confederates to attack out of the bridgehead. So the fortifications here are not the kind that we think of when we look at Brady's drawings or Brady's prints of Petersburg or something like that. Stout enough, we believe, to do what was necessary, but with some weakness here if the enemy decides to assail them. And the vantage point that we are viewing this scene from is roughly the ridge where Sedgwick is going to put the Federal artillery, the ridge that Howe has just taken, so you can get some sense of the distance as well. What exactly do these Confederate fortifications look like? Well, this is one of the places where most of what has been written about this battle before my book gets things very wrong. And the Civil War or the American Battlefield Trust map of this engagement has a lot of problems as to the shape of the fortifications and what certain of the Federal units are doing. I was fortunate in my research to find 2 maps that were drawn by observers or participants of the action at Rappahannock Station on November 7th. There are no official maps of this battle in the official records or the atlas to accompany the official records. And although the reports on these battles by Union Confederate officers offer a whole bunch of detail as to the position and the fortifications, as do the memoirs and the letters of the soldiers who fought here, the only maps that exist are these 2 that were drawn by many who were there, but not in an official capacity, the map makers for the battle. One of these is in the New York State Library, the one to the left. The one to the right is from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And if we look at these, they're not exactly the same. There's no scale here, but they tell us nonetheless a great deal. They're similar enough that the differences are not such that we can disregard these maps. So over here we see there's Norman's Ford, there's the railroad, the burnt bridge, there's the pontoon bridge, right? They're the hills on the south bank where the Confederates have their guns, and these hills that Early and Lee will watch the engagement. There's the railroad. Now this railroad, of course, is torn up, but it's on an embankment that's about 10 feet high as it goes across low ground toward the river. And therefore, it's a very easy demarcation line between the 5th Corps to the east, the 6th Corps to the west. And you can't really see. If you're on this ground here, you can't see across that railroad. This is a little stream called Tin Pot Run that runs along the northern base of the ridge where the Federals are going to put their artillery, crosses under the railroad, and then curves toward the Rappahannock here. And this is that big plot of flat ground. We were looking at that picture, those pictures of the Rappahannock Station area. This is the ground that we were looking at over here. You'll notice that this is the line where the Federal skirmishers are taking place. There's the Freeman Ford Road. So the Federal skirmishers are actually a little bit further back than that. This is a sunken portion of the road. On the east side of the railroad is the detached earthwork. It runs about 186 yards. It has a refused right flank that basically bends back with Tin Pot Run. This is where the 6th Louisiana is going to be. And it is completely incommunicado from the rest of the Confederate defenders on the other side of the railroad. This is a very steep hill here. And on top of that is what is a small Confederate fort, fully enclosed, that has 2 guns from Louisiana Guard Artillery. Then you have 300 yards of trench to a large redoubt that has 2 artillery pieces in it and is completely open back. And then the rest of the Confederate line parallels this bend in the river. Okay? If we look at this other map, we get some more detail. Now, this one omits the Confederate fortifications to the east, but it's got a much better look at the main Confederate line. So here are the 2 forts on the south bank where the Confederate artillery is. There's the ridge that Howe has just taken where the Federals are going to put their artillery. There's the small enclosed fort on the steep hill next to the railroad. Then there's that 300-yard trench. Then there's a large open redoubt. And then the real weak point in the Confederate defenses. So this is what military men call a tete de pont, a bridgehead, literally. But that means a fortified bridgehead. And the whole purpose of a position like this is to allow troops to cross the river and then assault out of these fortifications. So you've got to have the ability to move men and weapons and wagons through these forts. You can't have a solid wall of dirt here. And so where the road coming up from the pontoon bridge crosses through fortifications, you don't have a solid line. It's broken up so that the road can pass through. And anybody who's driven through a military checkpoint or where you have to sort of zigzag to get through it will kind of understand what we're looking at here very readily. To defend the 2 points where the roads cross through, the Confederates have built small outworks. And the idea is the troops behind them can fire between them and they'll cover the actual penetrations of the line. But you can understand that the men who are here are going to feel pretty out on a limb and vulnerable against a significant assault. So this is the weakest part of the Confederate line right there, right above where the pontoon bridge is. And then the rest of the Confederate line zigzags back toward the river. And most maps just show this as a smooth semicircle. But of course, no military man is going to build a smooth semicircle of fortifications. You're going to zigzag them so you create salients and opportunities for enfilading fire. One Federal observer said that the Confederate line had a sort of serrated appearance to it. The trench between the 2 forts is also very interesting, because it's a sophisticated trench. It's what's called a stepped trench. And so if you're familiar with World War I trenches, you're going to recognize this pretty quickly. It's dug in a dental pattern that prevents an enemy from getting in it and shooting down the length of the trench. Now, the parapets in front of all these Confederate trenches are relatively low. They're not really an obstacle. They would allow a man to climb them very easily. And once someone got on these, he would be looking down into a narrow trench that did not allow the men in it to maneuver in any significant way. And the distance here is so close that if you're in this trench, you have to fire obliquely to hit a man who's standing on the parapet, because if you try and shoot a guy right in front of you, you can't aim at him. The musket's too long. You'd have to point almost straight up in the air, and therefore you're unlikely to hit anybody. But this 300-yard trench here is dug in this pattern. But the rest of this trench is just a simple ditch with a low parapet thrown up in front of it. And remember, no abatis, no deep defensive ditches. You just got one naturally occurring ditch that sort of slices across the face of this ridge, a draining ditch that runs down the Freeman's Ford Road. So that's what the Confederate fortifications look like. That's what the Federals are facing. And initially, there weren't even enough Confederates to hold that entire line. Penn only has 900 men. He's got two full divisions that have advanced against him, a solid line of skirmishers, and of course, the bulk of two Federal corps behind them. So he has had to deploy his troops in the fortifications so that he's got the 6th Louisiana east of the railroad. He's got the 9th Louisiana holding that 300-yard trench between the two forts. He's got the 8th Louisiana holding the large redoubt and that area where the roads break up the trench line. And then he's had to deploy the 7th and 5th Louisiana on the left flank to keep the Federals from swinging down the Rappahannock River and overrunning the defenses from that direction, which means the center of his line initially is held by nothing but a thin screen of skirmishers. And so here again, we find a moment where Sedgwick has missed an opportunity. If he had let Bartlett and Howe simply keep going, and Howe begged for permission to keep going, and Wright would not give it to him for fear that his troops would be shot up trying to assail fortifications. If those two Federal divisions, or even one of those two Federal divisions that keep going, the Confederates once again would have had to abandon the fortifications. They didn't have a solid front. They couldn't have offered any meaningful resistance, and Sedgwick could have gotten these works at virtually no cost whatsoever. But instead, once the Federal skirmishers get to a point where they can seal off the fortifications and begin a sharpshooting duel with the rebels that's going to go on for almost 2 hours, the Yankees stop. And they bring up artillery and they try and shell the Confederates out of the fortifications. Confederate artillery responds in kind. The Federals bring up more artillery. There's a very loud and impressive artillery duel going back and forth, but neither side is able to do very much damage at all. And this bombardment is certainly not going to drive the Confederates out of their Rappahannock Station fortifications. However, the time that it takes to attempt doing this with artillery fire allows Early's division to reach the river. And the first of his brigades to come up is Robert Hoke's brigade from North Carolina. Now, Hoke isn't with them, and neither is his 21st North Carolina regiment. They've both been sent home to round up deserters. So today, the regiment is under the command of Colonel Archibald Godwin, a 6'6" Virginian, and he's got 3 regiments, the 54th, 6th, and 57th North Carolina. Now, the 6th and 57th North Carolina were Gettysburg veterans, but the 54th North Carolina, which has 580 men, so it's a very big regiment for this point in the war, was not at Gettysburg. That's why it's got so many men. It had instead been guarding the prisoners the Confederates had taken at the Battle of Winchester as they marched into Pennsylvania. The 6th and 57th North Carolina, however, like Louisiana Tigers, had been at Gettysburg, and on the evening of July 2nd, 1863, they had launched a dusk assault on Cemetery Hill, and they had actually briefly taken the position, might have won the battle if they had been reinforced. They were not. They had to eventually pull back. But these men understand the possibilities of a night attack. It's unlikely that they're going to be surprised. But these North Carolinians double quick across the bridge to reinforce Penn. This happens about the same time that Harry Hayes shows up, having left his court-martial responsibilities behind. He rides in to take command of his brigade, and he deploys Hoke's troops in the center of the line, filling in that weak point that had existed all afternoon. Lee's a little bit surprised to see Godwin's men moving into the bridgehead. He wasn't sure that he wanted to risk any more troops north of the river, but since they were already going across, he told Early to go ahead with the movement. And also the logic here is that the more formidable the bridgehead looks, the less likely Sedgwick will be to attack it, and therefore the big goal of locking half the Union Army in front of Rappahannock Station will be preserved. You'll be able to hold them there. And if you abandon the bridgehead or you leave it too weak, then that facade that might disappear and that accomplishment might evaporate to the detriment of the Confederates. So the Confederates bring up reinforcements. Sedgwick sees Confederate reinforcements entering the bridgehead. That makes him very nervous. Might mean a Confederate counterattack. So he orders Wright to bring up the rest of the Sixth Corps on the west side of the railroad, bring them into line adjacent to Howe so that they could blunt any Confederate counteroffensive. Lee, of course, is not thinking of doing this. He's concerned about holding on to the South Bank and his North Bank fortifications. And so as the brigades of Early's division come up, Hoke goes into the fortifications. Gordon goes to the east to Jameson's Ridge, which defends against a Federal crossing at Norman's Ford. Early keeps Pegram's brigade back as reserve. A.P. Hill has sent Anderson's division forward, and Anderson is told to send Posey's brigade and man the fortifications, blocking a Federal advance from Beverly Ford. One of Pegram's regiments, the 31st Virginia, mans the South Bank fortifications east of the railroad. The Federals, of course, have responded to this by bringing the rest of Wright's corps up alongside Howe. The Yankees have also brought more artillery up to bombard the Confederates on the Fifth Corps front. And this is basically where things are from roughly 3:30 until 5 in the afternoon, with this sharpshooter duel going on around the bridgehead itself. So here's the layout of the Confederate fortifications. You can see the 5th and 7th Louisiana have the western flank. The 54th, 6th, and 57th North Carolina are in the center. 8th Louisiana here around the large redoubt and the broken up portion of the earthworks. The 9th Louisiana holding that 300 yards of trench, and the 6th Louisiana over here on the flank. So now we have about 2,100 Confederate infantrymen inside the bridgehead, but there's still 26,000 Federals in front of them. The Louisianans know that because they've seen them. They share that news with the North Carolinians, and so all of these troops are very conscious of being out on a limb, that if the Federals throw their weight against them, there's no way that they're going to stop a Yankee onslaught that comes wave after wave after wave. And so they're not particularly happy about being where they are. Robert E. Lee is gambling. Lee's gambles usually work out, but this is one that's making these men very nervous. In some way, they shouldn't have been nervous because Sedgwick and Wright and Sykes were all completely disinclined to make an infantry attack on these Confederate fortifications. They would have to cross almost 500 yards of open ground to assail these Confederate fortifications. And those fortifications looked incredibly stout from the Federal vantage point. And why waste men's lives in attacking earthworks that are impregnable? So if it had been left to Sedgwick or Wright or Sykes, there would have been no assault. But it wasn't left to those three major generals. It was left, a way of putting it, to Brigadier General David Russell, who is commanding the 1st Division of the 6th Corps, which was Wright's own division until he had stepped up to temporary corps command. And Russell, along with Alvin Howe, is an interesting fellow because as part of the 6th Corps, it was their 2 units that had attacked and taken Marie's Heights during the Battle of Chancellorsville. So their 2 brigades had managed to seize the ground that the entire Army of the Potomac had not been able to seize the previous December. So these two guys, Wright and Howe, they do not have the instinctive fear of earthworks that a lot of the rest of the Army of the Potomac has. And Russell is very accustomed to making frontline reconnaissance, and he's been out here looking at what's going on right up here with the skirmishers, and he believes that the Confederate fortifications are held by nothing more than a strong skirmish line. And he lobbies with Wright for the chance to launch a dusk assault against them. And Russell's plan here is pretty clever. He's got the 6th Maine from his brigade, or at least half of it, 5 of its companies, on the skirmish line in this sunken road. Right next to them is a reinforced company from the 121st New York of Upton's brigade of the same division that Russell is commanding. And they're engaged in this sharpshooter duel with the rebels. What Russell proposes is that just about dusk, the other half of the 6th Maine comes from the other side of this ridge in skirmish line and advances to the sunken road. He knows that the Confederates are going to see that, and he suspects that they'll pay no attention to it because right before dark, they'll think that this is just one skirmish line relieving another. They won't fire at these guys. But once the 6th Maine is consolidated here, its commander, Colonel Benjamin Harris, will order his men to fix bayonets, uncap their muskets, and launch an immediate attack on the large Confederate redoubt. And that should catch the rebels by surprise. And as the 6th Maine engages here, the rest of Russell's 3rd Brigade, today under Colonel Peter Ellmaker, while Russell's got the division, will advance to reinforce the fight for the large redoubt. The 5th Wisconsin will make up a second line, moving in a column of divisions. It'll move about 100 yards behind the 6th Maine's reserve skirmish line. And so in about 5 minutes after the 6th Maine attacks, the 5th Maine should come in to reinforce them. And then 5 minutes after that will come the 119th Pennsylvania and the 49th Pennsylvania, which only has 4 companies, both in this column of division. And so 10 minutes after the assault begins, they will join in and they'll take this large redoubt. And by doing that, they'll be able to cut the rebels off from their pontoon bridge, and the entire Confederate position would collapse. Wright at first is hesitant, but when he thinks about it, he says, well, if we do this at almost dark, the rebels might be surprised. Their artillery will not be able to fire very well at us, and our artillery will be able to keep the rebels on the flanks engaged while this main assault happens, and the rebels firing from the other side of the river can't do anything but send indirect fire here. So this actually might have a chance of succeeding. And he gives Russell permission. So the Federals are going to make an attack because Russell's insisted on giving it a try. But he's underestimated the number of Confederates who are in those fortifications. So he's going to go forward with, roughly speaking, about 1,200 men. The 2 main assault regiments, the 6th Maine under Harris, the 5th Wisconsin, under Colonel Allen, only about 621 men. But by attacking in a column of divisions, the Federals are concentrating their strength on a very narrow part of the front. And therefore, at the point of contact, they will outnumber the enemy, which gives them a reasonable chance of getting into the fortifications and holding them until reinforcements could come up. The great danger, of course, is that because you're only striking on a very narrow front, Hayes and Hoke could pull regiments off the line elsewhere and concentrate a force to launch a counterattack that would expel the Federals from the fort. And that's probably what would have happened. If they had tried this in the daylight, it would have been shot to pieces. But moving at dusk is going to work for them because the Confederates are not going to be able to see the full extent of what the Federals are doing. And that's going to allow their imaginations to basically undermine their confidence in being able to stop a Yankee attack, because they're going to think that this is just the first edge of the wave after wave after wave of Federal hordes that they've expected to assail the fortifications all afternoon. Even with the cleverness of Russell's plan, it probably would have failed if not for unexpected help. That help's going to come from two places. First off, on the right flank of the 6th Maine, a reinforced company from the 121st New York, Upton's Brigade, under the command of Captain John Fish, is going to go forward with the 6th Maine. Now, Fish has no official role in this. He gets no orders to make this attack. But when the skirmishers had advanced early in the afternoon, Upton had told him to keep his men up with the furthest most point of Union advance. And so when he hears that the 6th Maine is going to attack, Fish says, well, I guess I'm supposed to attack too. On the left flank of the 6th Maine are 50 men from the 20th Maine Infantry under the command of Major Walter Morrell. Now, these are actually 5th Corps troops, and they were supposed to be east of the railroad. But the railroad made a slight jog as it neared the river. And so when the 5th Corps skirmishers had advanced, these 50 men from the 5th Corps and the 20th Maine had wound up on the west side of the railroad embankment. And while the long sharpshooter duel had been playing out, Major Morrell had gone over to visit friends in the 6th Maine, and so he was on hand when Harris came up and explained to his troops what they were about to do. And at that point, Morrell says, well, the 20th Maine can't watch the 6th Maine go in all alone, so he runs back to his troops and he says, all right, the 6th Maine is going in, let's go in with them. And the advance of these 50 men from the 20th Maine on the east side of the railroad, or west side of the railroad, are going to trigger the advance of 25 more men from the 20th Maine who are still east of the railroad, who, when they find out their comrades on the west side of the line are going forward, assume that, oh, somebody gave orders we didn't hear, I guess we're supposed to advance too, and their advance is going to trigger the advance of the rest of the Federal skirmish line against the outwork that is defended by the 6th Maine. So this is going to add something like almost 400 more Federal troops to the assault wave that Russell is sending in. So this is the way that the attack will actually unfold. So there's this reinforced 6th Maine skirmishers going in with fixed bayonets. The 121st New York's 50 skirmishers under Captain Fish going in to the right of the 6th Maine, and by happenstance hitting the weakest part of the Confederate line. The 20th Maine moving forward to attack the 9th Louisiana, holding that 300 yards of trench. And because of their advance, they trigger the advance not only of their own 20th Maine comrades on the other side of the railroad embankment, but also the advance of the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, and 16th Michigan skirmishers who sweep toward the 6th Louisiana and this isolated part of the Confederate line. Edwin Forbes is on hand to draw what's about to happen. And this is part of what he recorded. So here's the attack of the 5th Corps skirmishers east of the railroad. So here's the railroad embankment. You can see how tall it is. There are the pylons of the burned railroad bridge. There's that dam that I was telling you about. There's the hill with the Confederate South Bank artillery, and where Lee and Early are watching things. Not that they can see much. It's now got to be so dark that they can just see some vague movements, some muzzle flashes. There's a very stiff south wind, so no noise of the fighting carries to the South Bank. And Lee and Early are going to assume that they're just watching some intense skirmishing, that surely the Federals would not make a night attack. That's not something the Army of the Potomac does. Well, in this instance, it is something, at least, that portion of the Army of the Potomac commanded by David Russell is willing to do. This is the small redoubt and that steep hill. Here's part of that trench line that connects the two Confederate forts. This is the earthwork defended by the 6th Louisiana, except that the 6th Louisiana doesn't really defend it. It's got 186 men. Its Colonel Monaghan, sees these Federal skirmishers sweeping toward him. This is almost 400 Federal skirmishers coming at him. In the darkness, he can't see what's behind them, but it's logical to assume that if the skirmishers are coming forward, then at least a brigade, maybe a whole division, is coming forward behind them. And isolated as they are from the rest of the Confederate line by the railroad embankment, and cut off as they are from the South Bank, there's no way they're going to defend this position. And so Monaghan orders his men to move by their left flank, get to the railroad embankment, and then retreat across the river at the stone pylons. And about half of his regiment manages to get away before the Federal skirmishers get to the bank and begin to fire into the other half that hasn't escaped and is eventually going to capture about 70 of those men. And so the extreme right flank of the Confederate line collapses almost instantly, and only about half of its defenders manage to get away. On the other side of the railroad, this is the second part of Forbes' sketch. So there is what we were just looking at, the advance of the 5th Corps skirmishers. There's the railroad embankment. There's Tin Pot Run right there. This is the forts the Confederate artillery is manning on the opposite bank. There's the small fort on that steep hill. There's your 300 yards of trench leading to the large redoubt. This is the 6th Maine launching an assault. There's the 20th Maine skirmishers. The initial attack by the 6th Maine was stopped before it even got into the fort. A lot of the Federal troops taking serious fire. The Confederates weren't surprised by this. They opened fire on the Federals as soon as they began to move, pumped several very effective volleys into them so that the leading edge of the 6th Maine goes to ground in front of the fort. Some men even cry out that they surrender. Officers urge their men to get up and keep going. And so there's a second attempt to get in the fort, and a few men do, but they're immediately thrown out of it. And it looks like the Confederates are going to hold their line when the 5th Wisconsin, which had been delayed in its advance and so is 5 minutes late getting up to the front, manages to arrive. And it sends one wing to reinforce the fight for the large redoubt and another wing to hit the trench between the two forts. And this is the critical moment of the battle that Forbes is capturing right here. And for the Confederates, this is where the disaster begins. So the 6th Louisiana has already abandoned the right flank. The troops from the 20th Maine managed to take the sole Confederate gun that's still operating in the small fort. The 5th Wisconsin and the 20th Maine skirmishers managed to drive the 9th Louisiana out of this stepped trench. And the 6th Maine, eventually reinforced by half of the 5th Wisconsin, after serious hand-to-hand combat, very brutal fighting here, drive the 8th Louisiana out. And these men, do not know how many Federals are coming at them. This is all dark here. And the Federal choice to attack at dusk and to use division columns now plays on Confederate fears that this massive Federal force that they had seen deploy against them between noon and 3 o'clock is now coming at them. And this is just the leading edge of Federal brigade and Federal division after Federal brigade and Federal division. And once the Federals are into these works, you're not going to hold this position. And if you stay here, you're going to get cut off and captured. And so these Confederates, Harry Hayes among them, begin to drift back toward the railroad, or rather the pontoon bridge. Captain Fish's men had really good luck when they hit this part of the Confederate line. The Confederates here, holding the weakest portion of the defense, were equally unprepared to meet an attack. And when Fish and his handful get up there and they start shooting, they demand that the Confederates there surrender. And to Fish's surprise, about 120 Confederates throw down their arms. And he sends them to the rear, and so he's pierced the rebel line there. And as the 8th and 9th Louisiana drift back toward the pontoon bridge, 3 Federals from the 6th Maine, very brash fellows, run down into this now disorganized blob of Confederates, and they order them to surrender. They shoot their muskets from the air, and they order them to surrender. And to their shock, another 187 troops from the 8th and 9th Louisiana throw down their weapons and give up. And it's at this point that Harry Hayes is almost captured, but his horse bolts and flees across the bridge and carries him to safety. Some of his men follow suit. Others try to swim the river. Some of them make it. Some of them drown. Some of them are shot by the Federals in the attempt. But basically now the entire right flank of the Confederate line is gone. And although the Federals haven't captured the bridge, they're firing on it. and making any attempt by the Confederates to escape across it incredibly dangerous. So Russell's attack, thanks to those extra skirmishers going in with him, so far is succeeding brilliantly. But he had recognized when he got into this tough fight for the large redoubt that he had underestimated the number of Confederates defending the bridgehead, and he sent couriers back to Emory Upton and ordered him to bring forward 2 regiments to reinforce the fight for the large redoubt. Upton, very aggressive fellow, very ambitious, is more than eager to be part of this, and he brings forward the 121st New York and the 5th Maine, again in a column of divisions. But as he nears the battlefront, Russell sees him, rides over to him and says, look, we've already got the large redoubt. I don't need you there. What I need you to do is silence Confederate enfilade fire that's coming from this salient in their works. Now, Hoke's brigade under Godwin has pulled the 6th and 57th North Carolina out of the line to refuse the flank. And the 54th North Carolina is sort of spread out to try and occupy part of the trench line that's been abandoned. So they're spread out very thin, but they've been firing into the Federal flank. And Russell, who's been wounded in the foot now, but is still on the field, wants that fire stopped. So Upton swings his men into line of battle, takes them into this drainage ditch here, pauses long enough to give them the order to fix bayonets, to uncap their muskets, urges them to, remember their unit and state pride, and again gives the order to charge. And as he comes up this slope, the Confederates open fire, but it's now almost completely dark. They shoot too high. They only hit about 12 or so of Upton's men, and then the Yankees are in the trench. And the parapets here are very low. So remember, when the Federals mount those parapets, they're staring down with bayoneted muskets on Confederate troops in very narrow trenches. Those troops cannot effectively shoot at the men threatening them. And so the whole right flank of the 54th North Carolina essentially collapses. The Federals capture their flag after the briefest of hand-to-hand combat, and this part of the Confederate line now is gone. Upton senses a lot of confusion to his right with the rest of the 50 North Carolina, which is deeply discombobulated by what's happening. It's dark. They can't really see. The wind keeps them from really hearing. And Upton senses opportunity here. And so he sends word to Russell that he's going to renew the attack. And this is a drawing that Alfred Woad made of Upton's assault. In terms of the combat, it's not quite right. It shows that fight to be a little bit more intense than it was. But this drawing, nonetheless, is very important because Woad went to the site of the battle to make it. And so what can we see here? We can see the zigzag nature of the Confederate trenches. There's the large redoubt, which has already fallen. Over here is the small fort, which has already fallen, that 300 yards of trench between them. See how steep the ground is running to the river? See how wide the river is? There's the pontoon bridge. There are the burned pillars of the railroad bridge. So this gives us some idea of the terrain on which this fight is taking place. Upton's second assault, the exploitation phase of the battle, if you will. He sends the commander of the 121st New York, Colonel Mather, with one wing of his command to take the pontoon bridge. He leaves one wing of the 5th Maine to hold the trench that's already been taken. And then he pulls the other 2 wings of the 5th Maine and 121st New York out of the trenches and reforms them in front of the Confederate works, downslope where they're protected. Once he gets them in line of battle, he has them right face, doubling into a column, and then he races them at the double quick across the face of the Confederate fortifications. But since it's dark and he's downslope, this is the safest way to move his men. And once he gets them to where their rear is adjacent to Confederates, he halts, or he orders the command to move by the right flank, which throws it back into line of battle. Halts his men a few paces later, and then again urging them to rely on the bayonet, engages in some impromptu psychological warfare. He yells at the top of his voice that when the rebels open fire, that his men are to lay down because there are 4 lines of battle advancing behind them, and they'll overrun the rebel works. Now, there aren't 4 lines of battle waiting to charge behind Upton, but he knows the Confederates will hear this, and he's hoping that it will convince them that they're facing impossible odds. And in fact, that works. The Confederates, remember, know there are 2 federal corps in front of them. They don't expect the Yankees to be attacking them with such a small force, that basically equal odds by the time Upton's brought his 2 regiments forward. So this must be the leading edge of regiment after regiment after regiment of attacking Federals. Why throw your life away trying to stop that? And so when Upton's men hit the trench, the 54th basically capitulates right away. Its commander hands Upton his sword, and this entire regiment now and the whole center of the Confederate line is gone. Some fugitives flee down toward the river. A few flee toward the 5th and 7th Louisiana. And Colonel Clark Edwards of the 5th Maine sees these men running away, and he wants to catch these rebel fugitives. So he grabs 12 men, runs after them, and in the dark, he doesn't understand what he's doing. And before long, he finds himself standing behind the 5th Louisiana Infantry, almost in this line of file closers. And he recognizes that he has made a bad blunder. He's put himself and those 12 men in a place where they could very quickly be killed. And he decides that the only way to get out of his predicament is to bluff. So Edwards very loudly demands to know who's in command of this part of the Confederate line. And Captain John Angell, who's in charge of the 5th Louisiana, which only has 125 men, hears that demand, turns around and says, well, I am. Who wants to know? And Edwards identifies himself, and he demands the Confederates surrender. And Angell is completely taken aback. These Confederates in the 5th and 7th Louisiana have no idea what's happened over here. It's dark. They haven't been able to see it. It's windy. They haven't been able to really hear it. They've been skirmishing with the 5th Vermont in their front, and to suddenly have Yankees behind you, Angell doesn't know what to think. He doesn't know what to do, and so he stalls for time. He says, well, let me consult my officers. And Edwards says, no, I'm not going to give you a minute. Surrender right now, or I'm going to attack you. And Angell still hesitates, and at that point, Edwards plays his last card. He waves his hand behind him, where Upton's men are herding a couple hundred Confederate prisoners back out over the line. So in the dark, this is just a moving, indistinct mass of humanity. And Edwards says, you see all that behind me? Those are the rest of my regiments, and they're going to attack if you don't surrender. And at that point, Angell says, my men are facing the wrong way. If these guys attack, they're going to shoot us down from behind. And so he agrees to capitulate. And when the 5th Louisiana lays down its arms, then the 7th Louisiana has no choice. It has to surrender too. Now, the only part of the Confederate force that's still in the fight is the 6th and 57th North Carolina. And Colonel Godwin's with them, and he is urged by Colonel Tate, who commands the 6th North Carolina, to fight his way to the pontoon bridge and escape. But Godwin, showing more gallantry than logic, says, I have no orders to abandon the position. I'm going to stay here until I'm either reinforced or told to retreat. Neither of those things, of course, is going to happen. And eventually the Federals gather themselves together, and they come down the steep slope in the dark, and they surround the rebels here, and with very few casualties on either side, force them to surrender. So basically, within roughly 40 minutes of Russell launching his attack, the entire Confederate bridgehead has been taken. Some 1,600 Confederate prisoners, 4 artillery pieces. Confederate actual casualties are only about 30 or 40 men who've been killed or wounded. The rest do manage to escape, including most of the mounted officers and couriers. They manage to get away. And so the Federals have managed to destroy the bridgehead. Oh, sorry, leaping forward here. I don't want to leap forward yet. And as soon as Lee hears about that, he knows that his entire plan of defense has been undermined. Orders go out very quickly to Confederate teamsters and quartermasters to pack up all the supplies that have been accumulated for winter quarters and to get them back across the Rapidan as quickly as possible. And the Confederate logistic people do a great job. And a relative handful of hours, when not nearly enough horses and wagons to do it the way that it ought to be done, they load up most of the Army of Northern Virginia's critical supplies and begin a hasty and somewhat disorganized retreat toward the Rapidan. At midnight, Lee orders his infantry to begin to fall back toward Culpeper Courthouse. Now remember, he doesn't want to fight a battle in the Culpeper V. The terrain here is not conducive to it. His back is to the Rapidan, but he's got no choice but to make a stand in front of Culpeper on a ridge that will give him some protection, although his left flank will be completely in the air, and his right flank, though based on Pony Mountain, is only a couple miles from the river, and so if the Federals get between his right flank and the river, the whole army is cut off. Lee's got no choice but to make a stand here because he's got to buy a day for his wagons to finish getting across the Rapidan. So he's got to stand and offer battle. He deploys his cavalry to his front, Fitz Lee's division around Brandy Station, Hampton's division concentrating around Stevensburg to slow a Federal advance. But if the Federals move as aggressively on November 8th as they had moved on November 7th, the Army of Northern Virginia is in big trouble. It's going to have to fight a battle on the least advantageous ground that it has ever occupied, even though the Confederates fortified this line very, very quickly. Meade finds out about Rappahannock Station at 8 o'clock, about the same time that Lee does, but it's not till 10 o'clock that he's got enough information from Rappahannock Station to understand that Sedgwick has taken the position, but has not been able to exploit it. The attack came too late in the day, so he's missed another chance here. He can't get his men over the river. The Confederates had managed to burn part of the pontoon bridge to prevent the Federals from using it, and Sedgwick says there are still Confederates on the south bank. And that means that for Meade, the strategic situation hasn't really changed. Lee could be concentrating most of his army to attack the Third Corps, which so far is the only Federal unit that's on the south bank of the river. And although the Second Corps is scheduled to cross at dawn, 2 Corps versus the bulk of the Army of the Potomac Army of Northern Virginia, rather, are not the kind of odds that General Meade wants to gamble on. So he orders Sedgwick to shift the entire 5th Corps and 2 brigades of the 6th Corps to Kelly's Ford overnight. And the 1st Corps is supposed to come down and join this thrust across the river. And so once the troops begin to cross, the 3rd Corps will move toward Rappahannock Station to take in the rear whenever Confederates are still confronting Sedgwick, help Sedgwick get over the river, even though all Sedgwick's got now is a portion really of the 6th Corps. But once the Army is united, it will advance down the railroad toward Brandy Station, which is where Meade expects that Lee will make a stand. So the first thing that Meade's going to concentrate on the morning of November 8th is to unite his army. And this is, given the information he had on the evening of November 7th, this is a prudent, logical thing to do. And so here's what the Federals do on November 8th. You see the 5th Corps, 2 6th Corps brigades come down. Once they cross, though, the Federals basically move forward and form a defensive bridgehead around Kelly's Ford. The 3rd Corps goes up to meet the 6th, which is able to cross the river without opposition because the Confederates, of course, have pulled back. And not until these 2 corps are together does Meade launch an advance toward where he thinks Lee is at Brandy Station. The 6th Corps and the 3rd Corps go into line of battle on either side of the railroad, which takes some time, and then they advance 5 miles in line of battle toward Brandy Station. Quite the spectacle to see, but completely unnecessary because an advance guard of 2 regiments has chased Fitz Lee's cavalry out of Brandy Station. And the Confederate cavalry has stymied the advance of Davies' brigade of Kilpatrick's division towards Stevensburg. The Confederate Infantry Brigade under Lane is going to go and do the same thing to Buford's cavalry division, advancing down from Rixieville. But most of the morning is spent up uniting the Union Army. And by the time, and there's what happens on the Rixieville Road where Lane blunts the advance of Buford's division and keeps that part of the Union Army well away from Lee's main line. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Federals are at Brandy Station. There's still about 2.5 hours of daylight left. Lee's main line is only 2 miles away, and that line, remember, is relatively vulnerable. And there's enough daylight left that if Meade had continued to advance, he would have found it. Probably not with enough time to launch an attack against it that had a real chance of success, but probably enough time to launch an attack against it that might have entangled Lee in a battle from which he could not easily disengage. And even if Lee had disengaged, the Federals would have been in a position to make a rapid pursuit and potentially have caught Lee as he tried to cross the Rapidan. But Meade does not do that. He believes the stories of Confederate prisoners that say that, oh, the whole Army of Northern Virginia retreated across the Rapidan last night, even though that is, in terms of time and space, not even plausible. Meade believes it. He had been nervous about fighting his way across the river in the first place. He's managed to do that. He's managed to score a significant success at Rappahannock Station, and he's going to let well enough alone. If Lee's not waiting for him at Brandy Station to fight, Meade's not going to go looking for him. He's going to stop here. He's going to rebuild the railroad and bring up his supplies before he makes a further advance. And he doesn't want to go deeper into the Culpeper V for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. It's just not a very safe place to be. So having accomplished what he wanted to do, he's not going to seek to accomplish more. And that means that Lee is left unmolested. And on the night of November 8th, he is able to retreat safely across the Rapidan and take up the positions from which he will eventually face Meade's next offensive, which will be that of Mine Run. And so that's where the positions are. At the midpoint of November, the Federal cavalry's come forward to see where the Confederates are, but the bulk of the Army of the Potomac is exactly in the same place where it was on the afternoon of November 8th. And so Lee has again managed to withdraw after a tactical defeat. He has now on several occasions slipped away from Meade just as Meade thinks that he's going to land a significant punch, and managed to get into a new post to confront the next Union offensive. And that is where the situation will rest until the end of November and the commencement of the Mine Run campaign.
Jeff?
Yes.
Yes, if you will unshare your screen, we will go to, everyone can go to gallery view. Everyone, if you are familiar with Zoom, you know that somewhere on your Zoom screen is one of these call out type of balloon dialogue things that you see in comic strips. That's the chat function. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in there, and Jeff will respond. Are there any questions?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment to Jeff, and that is, thought it was a very thorough and well-organized presentation. Thank you very much. A lot of details, and I was especially impressed with the great maps that you had, as well as the drawings. These battles are very complicated to follow for someone that's not very familiar with the situation. And having the kind of detailed maps that you have with the movements on it made it very easy to follow what was going on. So very much appreciate that. Just one other very small comment, and that is as some people may or may not know, what used to be Rappahannock Station is now the town of Remington.
Right.
Ah, okay, great.
That's interesting in itself because current maps don't show Rappahannock Station anymore, they show Remington. And as another sort of irrelevant fact, I learned some time ago, is that Remington was the last municipality in Virginia to include the Confederate flag in its town seal and on its police department shoulder patches. And that didn't change until July of 2020.
Wow.
So interesting tidbit about the town of Remington.
Yeah.
So again, thank you very much for a great presentation, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff. For myself, I want to say that I don't believe I've ever understood as well the chess deliberations between commanders as your presentation. So I really appreciate it. We do have from Tom Newbig a question: why didn't the Union try fording at Beverly and Norman Fords?
So on the morning of the 8th, the Federals will put down a pontoon bridge at Norman's Ford and cross there. But essentially, and Meade's very aware of these, they were not places that you wanted to cross, mainly because it would diffuse your strength. If you threw elements of the Army over there, you made them vulnerable to a Confederate attack. So it was a concentration of strength thing against those Confederate fortifications, although Meade was kind of keeping Norman's Ford in his back pocket. So if you read the communication that's going on between him and Sedgwick on the night of November 7th, he's saying, well, if the Confederates are still, holding their pontoon bridge at Rappahannock Station, can you cross at Norman's Ford? Now, remember that the Confederates are holding Jameson's Ridge with Gordon's brigade, and that's looking down on Norman's Ford. So if the Federals had tried to cross there, they likely would have been shot to pieces attempting to do it. And you couldn't have gotten very far past Beverly Ford before you were going to run into more Confederate fortifications. And the Federals, of course, have no idea what the Confederates actually have on that south bank, but they're essentially assuming that those entrenchments are well manned, that there's lots of artillery in them. This is why Wright refuses Howe permission to go ahead and try and attack the Confederates after he seizes that ridge. He says, no, if you try that, the Confederate artillery on the south bank will blow you to pieces in a wall of canister, because he can see those entrenches over there, but there's nobody in them, and there are no guns in them. But you're calculating on the basis of the enemy doing the thing that's most dangerous to you, and you're thinking about his capabilities, if not his intentions. And so it's probably an excess of caution. It's certainly, if the Federals had done that when their skirmishers moved up, it would have completely undermined the Confederate defense. And so this is another opportunity that Sedgwick neglects, where he could have destroyed the bridgehead very quickly and very easily. And so he throws away at least 3 or 4 opportunities to do that.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Going once, going twice, 3 times. Okay, no other questions. Jeff, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this master course.
If there is somebody who'd like signed copies of the book, feel free to give them my email address.
I will.
I'm happy to correspond with them about doing that for them.
And I'm sure we'll look forward to your book on Mine Run, since it's just in our backyard, right? So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and Jeff, for your excellent presentation. We'll be signing off now. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.